Hello and welcome to the second of our lectures on the fur trade era. In the first lecture, we framed the global significance and global importance of the fur trade period. We then outlined the role that the fur trade has historically played in North America, outlined the role the fur trade played among indigenous peoples, and then outlined the components and mechanics of the fur trade, how the nuts and bolts of the fur trade industry worked. In today's lecture, we want to go through the four fur trade companies that worked in the Pacific Northwest. And then we need to talk about the consequences of the fur trade for the Pacific Northwest. Let's begin. The first company we want to talk about is the Northwest Fur Company. This is the first fur company to operate in the Pacific Northwest. It was formed in 1784 by former employees of the Hudson's Bay Company. We're going to talk about the Hudson's Bay Company in just a little bit, but the Hudson's Bay Company was a very old fur trading company. It existed in the 1670s, dating back to 1670. It was a British chartered company, so it was an officially chartered corporation with the British government. And it was a very big and powerful fur trading company, one of the wealthiest corporations in the world for the 18th and 19th centuries. What happened was they worked primarily in the Hudson's Bay and Great Lakes area, so in what is now Canada. And then these employees split and went west. Now, the Northwest Fur Company began its activities in the Pacific Northwest by funding the explorations of a Scottish explorer named Alexander Mackenzie. Alexander Mackenzie is a very important exploration figure in the story of the Pacific Northwest. He came out here in 1789 initially. His first expedition is in 1789. And he was out here in search of the Northwest Passage. Remember, James Cook had concluded that there was no sea or saltwater Northwest Passage. There was no oceanic way through the North American continent. But there was still a thought that there might be a series of river networks. We talked about this with respect to Lewis and Clark, and it's ultimately Lewis and Clark who conclude definitively for the Western world that this Northwest Passage, as envisioned, doesn't exist. But when Mackenzie comes out here, it's not really understood yet, so he decides to search for it in addition to all the things that are necessary for establishing the Northwest Fur Company. So he comes out here, travels streams out of what's called the Great Slave Lake, follows that to the Arctic. That river that he followed is now named after him, called the Mackenzie River. That was what he did in his first expedition. In his second expedition in 1793, he actually had spent some time back in England getting some training. And his goal is to find the headwaters of the Columbia River. By 1793, it's his goal to find the headwaters of the Columbia River. If you recall, in 1792, Robert Gray had made a claim to the mouth of the Columbia River, an American claim. And so what you have is the Northwest Fur Company, which is a British company, hoping to make a claim to the source of the river, and in doing so, challenge the American claim to the river itself. So in 1793, he goes on an expedition to try and find the source of the Columbia River. He fails, but explores and charts other river systems. And Mackenzie's work out here becomes the basis for the later fur trade that the Northwest Fur Company will engage in. But the most famous figure of the Northwest Fur Company is the gentleman who's on the right of your slide here. His name is David Thompson, and he will spend 13 years out here, 1799 to 1812, exploring, mapping, and documenting everything he can about the Pacific Northwest. Now, real quick, by the time we get to the 19th century, the term that is being applied to what we think of today as the Pacific Northwest is the Oregon Country. It's the Oregon Country. By the early 19th century, the term that is being used to describe this region is the Oregon Country. So that's the terminology I'm going to be using from here on out. But it's just the era-specific term to describe what we think of as the Pacific Northwest and parts of Pacific Canada. So in 1799, David Thompson comes out here and begins to explore the Oregon country. Thompson is a prolific explorer whose work is foundationally important for British claims to the region, for British Canada, and for the Northwest Fur Company. He is the person who will discover the source of the Columbia River. He does so in 1807. He also founds a lot of trading posts, fur trading posts for the Northwest Fur Company. So he has generally good relationships with indigenous peoples in order to found these things. Between 1807 and 1811, he will found several trading posts in this region, the most famous which are Killspell House, Salish House, and in 1808, Spokane House. And Spokane House is actually the first permanent non-indigenous settlement in what is now the state of Washington. It was located somewhere along the Spokane River near the confluence of the Spokane and Columbia rivers. So he is prolific in creating trading posts. Now, in 1811, Thompson makes what will be his most important expedition and what he hopes will be the most consequential for the Northwest Fur Company and for British claims to the Pacific Northwest, to the Oregon country. So in 1811, he decides to travel the length of the Columbia River, the entire length from its source all the way to the mouth. Now, you have to understand something. By 1811, Robert Gray already has an American claim at the mouth of the Columbia River, and Lewis and Clark's expeditions have extended American claims to the Oregon country. But there are no permanent American settlements out here, and settlements matter perhaps the most for claiming a land in this period of imperialism. And so Thompson has created a lot of settlements. What he wants to do is found settlements all the way from the source of the river right to the mouth, an unbroken chain of settlements for the river that is the defining physical feature of the region. And in doing so, effectively claim this as not just Northwest Fur Company land, but British land. So that's his goal. So in 1811, he begins that process. And he reaches nearly, and he does this, and he travels the whole length of the river, founding additional fur trading posts the whole way. The problem occurs when he gets to the mouth of the Columbia River. Because when he gets to the mouth of the Columbia River, he finds an American fur company employees are already there creating a fort. And therefore, there is an American presence now. Had he gotten there a few months earlier, there would have been no American presence. But there is. And that presence is the Pacific Fur Company. And that's the one we're going to talk about next. So, when Thompson concluded his great explorations, all the way down, all those trading posts, when he got to basically the mouth of the Columbia River, roughly where modern-day Vancouver is today, he discovered that a new fur company called the Pacific Fur Company, that company is creating a fur trade post at the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers on the Oregon side, so opposite modern Vancouver, well, a little bit further west of that, called Fort Astoria. And in doing so, has established an American physical presence in the region. But let's talk about this company and who they are. So this is the Pacific Fur Company. The Pacific Fur Company was actually a very short-lived fur company. It only existed from 1811 to 1813. But its significance is much more important than the brevity of its duration, because it's hugely important for American claims. In fact, it will be central to American claims in competition for control of the Oregon country. The Pacific Fur Company was founded by John Jacob Astor. You can see him there on the right. John Jacob Astor was a wealthy German immigrant. So he was a German immigrant who became an American citizen and became quite wealthy in the United States. A lot of his wealth was derived from the fur trade. Now, the Astor family will get into all sorts of other industries. In fact, the Astors will become a really, really wealthy family in the 19th century, arguably one of the wealthiest families in American history throughout the 19th century. In fact, the Astors were so wealthy, they had homes with all the other wealthy in a place called Newport, Rhode Island. There were Astors who were on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. They're a very, very wealthy family in the 19th and early 20th century, and this is the origin of their wealth. It's John Jacob Astor and his fur trading empire. So Astor created this company called the American Fur Company that operated in the Great Lakes, and he decided that he wanted to expand business operations to the Oregon Country, and so he founded this Pacific Fur Company to do so. Astor was not just a business person. He actively wanted to claim the Oregon Country for the United States, and so he saw this company as doing part of that. So this company was founded around 1810, and he sends 2 expeditions to the Oregon Country. The first we want to talk about is a sea expedition led by a guy named Duncan McDougall. This was actually a pretty notorious expedition because the captain of the boat was notorious for his cruelty and for rebellions against the captain, but we won't talk about that. But it's kind of a notorious sea voyage. It's the sea route that arrives in the Pacific Northwest at first in 1811. They're the ones who land after a pretty difficult journey and a pretty rough issue. So that happens. That eventually they land in 1811 and begin to build the fort. That's the group that that David Thompson discovered. He also sent out a land group under the leadership of a gentleman named Donald Mackenzie. The land group really struggles. The party suffered badly through lack of planning, lack of foresight, just an inability and dysfunction on the journey. And as a consequence, the party suffers badly. Some turn back, some die. Eventually, the survivors make it to Fort Astoria to help reinforce. So by 1811, the Pacific Fur Company is operating here. But the Northwest Fur Company has a much bigger operation and a more established operation here. They're much bigger with more resources, with more places of business here. While the Pacific Fur Company and the Northwest Fur Company are operating here, war breaks out between the United States and Great Britain. It's called the War of 1812. The War of 1812 lasts between 1812 and 1815, although the war is actually concluded by a peace treaty in 1814. Fighting continues until 1815 because it takes months for communication of the end of the war to reach the Americas. We're not going to talk about the War of 1812 really at all in this lecture. If you want to know about the War of 1812, you should take a United States History 1 class or any U.S. history class that covers the early 19th century, because they'll cover the war for you. But the big picture here you need to know is the War of 1812 is effectively a conflict between Great Britain and the United States. Contrary to what some people will tell you, it is not a second war of independence, because Britain is not the aggressor in this war. They had no intention of trying to take, quote unquote, the United States back and make it a colony. It was the United States that actually was the aggressor in this war and declared war on Great Britain. But nonetheless, war breaks out. And for the most part, the war doesn't go particularly well for the United States. They win some major battles, but they also have the capital, Washington, D.C., occupied and burned by the British. So it doesn't go particularly well for the United States. Ultimately, it ends up being a stalemate, a standoff, um, and peace is reached. Where it impacts the Oregon Country or the Pacific Northwest is that when word of the war breaking out reaches the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific Fur Company uses that, the Northwest Fur Company uses that to its advantage in its rivalry with the Pacific Fur Company. So what happens is essentially a detachment of ships from the British Navy sails up the Columbia River to Fort Astoria and makes the employees of the Pacific Fur Company living in Fort Astoria an offer. They can sell the fort and their business operations to the Northwest Fur Company, or the naval ships will attack and take it by force, and whoever is left over will be a prisoner of war. Given those terms, and that there's no American Navy presence coming out to assist the Pacific Fur Company, under military duress and threat, they sell the business to the Northwest Fur Company. They sell it. And thus ends the first American Fur Company presence in the Oregon Country. And now the Northwest Fur Company is the only company here, meaning that a British company controls the territory from a non-Indigenous perspective. Keep in mind, Indigenous people's rights are not being considered here. It's racist and it's outrageous and it's amoral and a whole host of other things. But it's also the world that 19th century imperial powers were operating under around the world. They weren't acknowledging the rights of Indigenous peoples. So from an imperial perspective, now the British control this region. However, peace is reached in 1814 between the British and the United States. The British didn't want to fight the War of 1812. They were busy fighting the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And by 1814, many in the United States who had been pushing for war realized that their war aims were not going to be realized, that they weren't going to get the territories that they sought. And so as a consequence, there was a feeling that in the United States that peace should be reached. And Britain had never wanted the war to begin with. So they meet in a place called Ghent, and they negotiate what's called the Treaty of Ghent, which is negotiated in 1814. The Treaty of Ghent, we don't need to talk about the particulars, but we do need to talk about one clause. The one clause we need to talk about says that all territory acquired by either side through military conquest must be returned. And therefore, all territorial claims become what's known in the treaty as status quo ante bellum, which is just a Latin phrase that means standing by that which was before the war. Meaning there's no loss of territory or territorial claims. So take Fort Astoria. It had been purchased. It's not given back to the Pacific Fur Company because the Northwest Fur Company had purchased it. It remains their possession. They rename it Fort George after the King of England. It will later be called Fort Vancouver after George Vancouver. So it remains in Northwest Fur Company hands. But the territorial claim that was established by the Pacific Fur Company to the Oregon Country on behalf of the United States, that remains relevant. Because even though they sold it under military duress. So Britain doesn't actually gain any territorial advantage here, but they do gain just economic advantage that might turn into an imperial advantage, if that makes sense. So the next company we want to talk about is also a British company. It's the Hudson's Bay Company. I've alluded to them before. It is the oldest of the fur companies. It was founded in 1670. It had a monopoly on most Canadian fur trade by virtue of the British government. And in 1821, the British government compels the Northwest Fur Company to merge with the Hudson's Bay Company. It wasn't something that the Northwest Fur Company's employees and owners necessarily wanted, but they were compelled to by the British government. For you to understand how that works, I just want to explain to you a little bit about how the British government works vis-a-vis its imperial territories. Britain has a global empire by the 19th century. By the time this merger is forced upon the Northwest Fur Company, Britain has colonial territories they basically control the Indian subcontinent. So what is now Pakistan, India, parts of Nepal belong to the British government. They have significant interest in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. They have possession of Canada. They have possession of territory in the Caribbean. And they are starting to make inroads into Africa. So it's an expanding empire. But it's an empire that is very expensive to maintain and whose economic value benefits certain groups in Great Britain, but not other groups. And that becomes a really tenuous and tense domestic policy issue within Great Britain in the 19th century. I bring this up because in order to save money, what Britain largely did was it outsourced its imperial ventures to private companies that were chartered by the British government, that paid taxes to the British government, that were often heavily regulated by the British government, but in exchange for those things had monopolies over trade in certain regions of the British Empire. And they also operated as de facto governments in those areas. The best example I can give you of this is the British East India Company. The British East India Company was the company that until the 1850s will be in charge of what occurs in India. And they're a private corporation. Yes, their board of directors is appointed by Parliament in Britain. And yes, it's chartered by the British government, and therefore Britain can revoke the charter, and ultimately that's what happened. But for the most part, we're talking about a private corporation that was sponsored, supported militarily by the British government, and effectively not just made money through monopolies in India, but also had governing responsibility. And the Hudson's Bay Company is like that. They're expected in the western part of Canada and now into the Oregon country to not just be the fur trading monopoly, but also to be the de facto government and an imperial arm of the British government. And that's effectively how they operate. So the Hudson's Bay Company's North American operations were run by a guy named George Simpson. And George Simpson, who is headquartered back east, so his headquarters are in the sort of eastern part of Canada, but he's in charge of what happens in the Oregon country, and he's a staunch expansionist. And what he wants to do is ensure that the Oregon country becomes part of British Canada, so part of the British Empire. Remember, no imperial power has total claim over this area, and there's 4 countries claiming it: Russia, Spain, Britain, the United States. George Simpson wants to make sure that those other three get pushed out. And so he wants the Hudson's Bay Company to pursue policies that exclude Russians, Spaniards, and Americans. And that's the directive he gives to the individual who is responsible for governing from Fort Vancouver the Oregon Country operations for the Hudson's Bay Company. And that's the gentleman who you see on the right here. His name is Dr. John McLoughlin. So McLoughlin is out here. And when McLoughlin gets out here in 1821, and when he founds Fort Vancouver in 1824, which is in the modern-day city of Vancouver, to be the capital of the Hudson's Bay Company operations here, and it becomes the largest settlement in the Oregon Country. When he does that, when he gets out here, he notices something. And what he notices is that American fur trappers are coming. And there's really no way to stop them. There's really no way to stop them. Now, what George Simpson wants John McLoughlin to do is basically go to the borders of the Oregon Country, the areas of the Louisiana Territory that were near the Oregon Country, or to the border with Spanish California and the Spanish Southwest. And what he wants McLoughlin and his employees to do is basically just do scorched earth, to overtrap the entire area. And the reason that he wants them to do that is that if you overtrap that area, then what would happen is that trappers would either have to retreat from that border area because there would be no economic activity there, or they would have to go further interior into the territory, the Oregon Territory, and Hudson's Bay Company would be easier to sort of capture them and eject them out. So that's what George Simpson wants John McLoughlin to do, and he tries to do some of that, but it's not really practical. And McLoughlin has a realization that Simpson never seems to have, which is that Americans are coming not in massive numbers in the 1820s, but by the 1830s and into the 1840s, more American fur trappers are showing up. And then later, missionaries start to show up. And then later, homesteaders and pioneers start to show up. As you get from the 1820s into the 30s and into the 40s, more Americans are showing up. And the reason for that is that America is closer to the Oregon Country than Great Britain. There's not a mass migration from the British Canadian cities like Montreal or Ottawa, right? There's not a massive migration from Eastern British Canada west. And there's certainly not a massive migration from the British Isles out to the Oregon Country. And because of that, the numbers are always going to favor the Americans. McLoughlin can't stop them. And he realizes that. So what McLoughlin begins to do is try and figure out what parts of the Oregon Country are the most valuable for the Hudson's Bay Company. And those are the parts that he's going to jealously guard. He's going to jealously guard the relationships with indigenous peoples and create exclusive trading relationships with them so the Americans can't penetrate it. And he's going to keep Americans out. And what McLoughlin basically decides is that what is now Western Washington, especially as you work your way north to the Puget Sound and then up into Canada. That's the most valuable fur trading area in the region. So that's the area he's going to focus his attention on controlling. So when American fur trappers and missionaries and later farmers and pioneers and homesteaders come out, and I'm talking about throughout the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. By the way, we will talk about these peoples in the next unit, the waves of people coming over and how they get here and why they get here. But as those people start to pour in, McLaughlin realizes they're going to show up to Fort Vancouver because it's the natural place to get your supplies. And it's the natural place to keep buying supplies. It's the biggest settlement in the area. And McLaughlin realizes what he can do is be kind to these American arrivals, and through his kindness make suggestions for where they settle. And if they refuse to settle where he wants them to, what he can then do is refuse to trade with them, and in doing so deny them the supplies they're going to need. So he's leveraging his position to protect what he wants, which is the western part of Washington, the Puget Sound, all the way up through Vancouver Island and British Columbia. He's made a decision. This is not what his instructions were. And George Simpson is going to be furious about it. Lots of people in Canada and the British government are going to be furious about it. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But they're furious with it. But this is the pragmatic decision that McLaughlin makes, because his original instructions, he believes, are unenforceable, and he's very much right. So what he starts to do is offer friendship to Americans if they settle south of the Columbia River, like the Willamette River Valley in Oregon, or east of the Columbia River, like in what is now eastern Washington or parts of eastern Oregon or Idaho. They settle there, and he'll be their best friend. He'll trade with them. He'll provide them with good terms. He'll assist them. They settle where he doesn't want them to, and he becomes an enemy, withholding any support that he has. And people coming out here need to be able to work with the fur trappers and fur traders. So McLaughlin already realizes that from an international perspective, some sort of negotiation is going to happen with the Oregon country, and America is going to be part of it. But that wasn't what his instructions were, and it wasn't what people thought. And it wasn't what certainly the British government would have wanted him to do. The last of the fur companies we need to talk about is the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. As the name suggests, it was mostly located in the Rocky Mountains, but they did operate in the Pacific Northwest, in the Oregon country, enough to stake an American claim. So this company was founded in 1823 by two former Army officers, Major Andrew Henry and General William Ashley. And their goal is simply to conduct fur trade in the Mountain West, including the Oregon country. They were originally, the idea was that they would stay purely in defined American territory, but these employees of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company went everywhere. They went into the Spanish West. They went into Hudson Bay Company territory. They went basically anywhere they want, and in doing so, maintained an American presence in the Oregon country. Part of the reason that they were so difficult for the Spanish or the Hudson Bay Company to keep out was they had a very unique operating structure. Their employees were known as mountain men. They lived in the West. And for the most part, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company didn't rely on forts. They had a few forts. But for the most part, they didn't rely on forts. They relied on something called rendezvous. Rendezvous is just a French term that means come here. It's a command, effectively. Those of you who know you're French, it's the imperative, or l'impératif. It's the command mood of verbs. And it just means come here. Return yourself to here is literally what it means. It was a term for a meetup. And what would happen is the mountain men would pass word to fur trappers fur traders and local tribes that at a specific place at a specific time, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company would be there and you could trade goods and everyone could move on. That way, they didn't have the physical cost of maintaining a fort. And even though these rendezvous were well known, they had to be to make any kind of money, it was very difficult for the British or the Spanish to try and stop them from happening. Ultimately, from a business model, it wasn't all that successful. And the Rocky Mountain Fur Company struggled until they started creating physical forts to make any profit. But what became really important were the employees themselves. These mountain men became the Americans who knew the geography, topography, and landscapes of the West the best. People like Benjamin Bonneville, who used his knowledge to lead the first wagons across the Rocky Mountains. Jedediah Smith, who fur trapped in Oregon despite opposition from the Hudson's Bay Company and began to know all the best paths and places to stop on the trail. Jim Bridger, who would later become a guide to pioneers on the Oregon Trail and will have a fort on the Oregon Trail named after him, Fort Bridger. William Sublette, along with his brother, became a guide on the Oregon Trail and created what was known as a Sublette Cutoff, which cut something like 40 days of travel off the Oregon Trail. These mountain men, when the fur trapping was no longer profitable and when the animals became scarce, turned to becoming guides for the thousands upon thousands of farmers and homesteaders who wanted to come to the Oregon country. And without the knowledge of these individuals, the Oregon Trail never would have been founded. These people are the critical components for the Oregon Trail, for getting people through the Rocky Mountains, across the Blue Mountains, and into the Oregon country. These employees will become so significant for the history of the West. So the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, as a business, is never all that successful. But the mountain men become tremendously important for the history of the West and the history of the Oregon country. Let's talk about the consequences of the fur trade. The fur trade era in the Oregon country, in the Pacific Northwest, was actually quite brief. It's effectively done by the late 1830s and 1840s. There's still fur trade going on all the way until the 1860s. But there's been two things that have happened. The first thing is environmental. The beaver and the otter populations just declined. They were overtrapped. And in being overtrapped, it was just harder and harder to get a hold of them. And so there's an environmental impact here that leads to the decline of the fur trade. The other thing you need to be aware of is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution has originated and exploded in Great Britain. It's beginning to spread to other places, like in a very small way, the United States by the 1830s and 40s, but also on the European continent. One of the first industries that industrialization takes root in is textiles. Textiles being anything woven, clothing, linens, blankets, so on and so forth. And industrialization is about mass production. And mass production leads to more goods, to a greater supply of goods. And with greater supply, prices went down. And so clothing just became, or anything made of fabric, just became a lot less expensive. And that, in part, destroyed the market for furs. So furs were getting hard to get a hold of because of overtrapping and environmental degradation. And then you add to that the market was less monetarily for those pelts, and the industry just begins to kind of die out. But the increased presence of non-native peoples is here. The first physical permanent residents who were not native are here. And then you have the trappers who have the knowledge of the area to help facilitate movement and settlement of peoples. It is transformative, and it lays the groundwork for the next phase of settlement. But it also begins to clarify the international ownership question of the Oregon Country. Because when the fur trade era starts, there are 4 countries claiming this region: Spain, Russia, Britain, the United States. What the fur trade era results in is a policy called joint occupation, by which only the United States and Great Britain have claim to this region from an international perspective. Once again, because of their racist, prejudicial, one could argue genocidal thoughts towards indigenous peoples, they do not consider them to have a legitimate claim to the land. So let's talk about the process by which, from the perspective of the international community, only the US and Great Britain have the right to settle this land. This is known as joint occupation. But before we get to how joint occupation comes about, we need to understand the claims of the 4 countries and then how 2 of those countries' claims get wiped away. So if you recall, Spain is claiming this area because of exploration, the settlement of Nootka Village, and most importantly, the exclusive rights to North America guaranteed by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Russia is claiming this as an extension of their Alaska settlement and the exploration of Vitus Bering. Great Britain is claiming this area because of exploration like Cook and Meares, the Nootka Agreement, in which Spain had to concede that they could be here, and their fur trading companies who have been operating here the longest and most thoroughly. The United States is making a claim based on exploration like Robert Gray, the expedition and mapping and claims established by the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark, and the Pacific Fur Company, and to a lesser extent, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. So those are the claims. How do these claims get adjudicated on the international level? Well, it begins with the Treaty of Ghent that we referenced earlier in 1814. The Treaty of Ghent, in addition to returning territorial possessions and claims to status quo antebellum, to how things were before the war, it also resulted in diplomatic relationships and a call for diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Great Britain. Effectively, what the United States and Great Britain realized is that one of the major causes of the War of 1812 was the lack of a border, a lack of a recognized, defined, established border between British Canada and the United States. In particular, the border around the Great Lakes was a problem, but you also had to deal with the fact that you also had to deal with the question of where the border was on the Great Plains, where the border was in the Rocky Mountains. And so, as a part of the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, both sides said that they needed to meet again in the coming years to establish the border between British Canada and American territory. That meeting happened in 1818 at what's known as the Convention of 1818. So the Convention of 1818 was the British negotiators and the American negotiators sitting down and saying, where's the border between British Canada and our territory? Very quickly, they were able to establish the St. Lawrence in the northeast. They effectively split the Great Lakes so that both had access to the Great Lakes. And then when they got to the Great Plains, they established the 49th parallel all the way through the Rocky Mountains. Now, when they got to the Oregon Country, which is Idaho, Washington, Oregon, parts of British Columbia, the negotiations broke down. They could come to no sort of agreement on it. And so they said, we've done good work on the other parts of North America. Let's codify this. Let's sign this agreement. With respect to the Oregon Country, let's agree to joint occupation. This idea that both of us have the right to occupy it. Both of our citizens, both of our businesses have the right to be there. And so they agreed on joint occupation. Now, it doesn't mean the Hudson's Bay Company was going to be a happy partner in this, and it doesn't mean they weren't going to try and keep the Americans out, and everyone kind of knew that would happen. But legally speaking, Americans had the right to be in the Oregon Country, as did the British. And that's what they agreed to, joint occupation. So as part of the Convention of 1818, joint occupation was agreed to by the United States and Great Britain. And they said, we'll revisit this in 1827. So the United States has an agreement with Great Britain. But what about Spain and Russia? Well, Spain's claim to the Oregon Country gets taken care of in 1819 with something called the Adams-Onassis Treaty. The Adams-Onassis Treaty. The Adams-Onassis Treaty, some of you might be familiar with it. Some of you might know something about it. And if you do know anything about it, it's named after the Spanish foreign minister and the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who would then go on to become President John Quincy Adams after the election of 1824. And he himself was the son of John Adams, the second U.S. president. But it's named after these two people who negotiated it. The principal primary concern of the Adams-Onassis Treaty is Florida. The United States wanted Florida. That had been one of the major goals of the War of 1812. Florida was a Spanish possession. And so what happens with respect to Florida is the United States makes an offer with respect to the Adams-Onassis Treaty. Effectively, they say, Spain, if you give us possession of Florida, we will forgive your debts to us. Or we will just take Florida. And Spain is in no position in 1819 because of the aftermath of the French Revolution, because of rebellious movements that are in Spanish colonies in North America. They're in no position to fight a war with the United States to keep Florida. And so they basically accept the American offer. And so America takes possession of Florida. But there's a little known clause in the Adams-Onassis Treaty that says that in addition to giving up Florida, Spain gives up all claims to territory north of California. So effectively the Oregon Country. So the Adams-Onassis Treaty means that Spain has abandoned any claims to the Oregon Country. So Spain is out. Russia is removed as a consequence of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is very, very, very famous in American history because it's effectively the first time the United States ever really articulated a foreign policy position. It's the first time the United States ever really articulated a foreign policy position. It's seen as the guiding principle of American foreign policy until basically World War I. Now, that's not entirely true, but certainly it looms large for the next century, give or take. It's called the Monroe Doctrine because it's issued by President James Monroe. The Monroe Doctrine is mostly about Latin America. By 1823, revolutions, independence movements have broken out across Spanish colonial possessions in Latin America. They've broken out in the Caribbean. They've broken out in Mexico. They're breaking out in South America. It's very clear that these movements are likely to be successful. But the United States recognizes that there are other more powerful European imperial players, primarily Great Britain, but also France, possibly even the Dutch, possibly even Russia, who might try and take advantage of this situation and to swoop in and claim the portions of these colonies or entire colonies for themselves. And the United States decides it's not in its interest. In fact, the United States decides that the Americas are their special sphere of influence to do with what they want. And so what the Monroe Doctrine says is that the United States will not tolerate and will consider as an act of war any attempt by a European power to take new territory in the Americas. So it's not about existing European colonies in the Americas. It's about an attempt to take new land. And it's mostly directed at European powers with respect to the revolutions that are beginning to get underway in Spain's Latin American holdings. So that's mostly what it's about. However, it's also pointing the finger at Russia and saying, look, we will not take kindly any attempts for you to press your claims south of Alaska. And Russia, the following year, gives up any claims that Russia in 1825, so 2 years later, in 1825, Russia says, all right, we are not going to make any claims on the Oregon country. Now, make no mistake about it, the Monroe Doctrine is a statement of American imperialism. It's basically saying that the Americas is our place to influence and direct and expand into. It is not a benign statement. It represents an imperialist view of the Americas, particularly North America, and what America considers its rights to be here. But for the perspective of eliminating Russia from this conversation, it has the intended effect. So it's now down to Great Britain and the United States. They meet again in 1827, and they still cannot come to any agreement about how to separate the Oregon country, to divide it. So they agree to extend joint occupation. And joint occupation will remain in effect until 1846. But we'll talk about that in the next unit. So I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.